Cool, man. So what's going on in the Agile industry right now? What are you seeing?
There's a lot more people than, it's interesting, like if you take time frames of the last couple of years, but if you look over the last 10, 20 years, right, everyone has automated builds. Everyone is trying to do some type of CI, CD. People have, infrastructure as code, which we hadn't even thought of back then.
Right.
So there's a lot of the practices that are, picking up. I think sometimes I just worry that, now people are doing the practice because that's the thing to do, and they don't necessarily remember why we invented those things in the first place.
Yeah, let's explore that. We were talking over lunch today about the idea that it feels like everything is happening in slow motion because it takes months, years to get change going. But when you look at just over 10, 15 years, 20 years, right, the amount of change. So everybody's doing it. You're concerned that maybe they're not doing it right. What are some of the patterns that you see when people are going through the motions of those technical practices?
Yeah. So if I talk to someone and they say, we've got a DevOps initiative, right? If you say, well, what are you doing? They're going to go deeper into we're using these technologies and so forth. And I say, so why are you doing it? And they usually look at me like, well, because we should do DevOps.
Yeah.
And it's like, all right, so are you trying to get software to production more quickly? Are you trying to reduce defects? Are you trying to empower your teams to work with less dependencies? What are you trying to solve? Because I agree you should be doing DevOps probably.
Yeah.
But if you know what you're going to solve, you probably have less work to do.
So you mean you actually want to connect the implementation of the technology to a real business problem?
Right. Because then we can say, oh, well, we don't need to do those three things now because we're not trying to deliver real time to production. It still has to go through this process, but right now we need to solve these three problems. Well, let's solve those as quickly as possible, get the return on the investment, and start using that to fund the next things, right?
Yeah.
And if you have to know the why, otherwise you just aim for completeness. And then you're like, well, I just need to do all of DevOps as much as I can. And, it starts, and then you can't talk to the business about why this is something they should invest in. It's actually going to pay dividends, probably this release, next release, not years from now.
So not DevOps for the sake of DevOps, but DevOps for the sake of solving a business problem.
Right.
So talk to me. Tell me a little bit about the kinds of business problems people should be thinking about when they're considering a DevOps transformation.
So for DevOps specifically, quality, right? So do I need to improve my quality? Speed and resiliency. Are my teams able to move fast enough? And if I'm moving things, ultimately, building software, releasing software, moving it between environments, the job is you want the same thing to happen every time consistently. So automating it makes a lot of sense. In the end, we're trying to reduce the cost of development to make it easier to bring new people into the team so I can grow faster. And then ultimately make sure that individual pieces, so if you're at a more advanced level, where now I've got 10 teams and I want those teams to be able to work independently. Now I need to be able to use DevOps to build that software, or one team can upgrade, I make sure it didn't break anyone else, and then I can put that into production without the other teams needing to be involved.
So assume I'm a seasoned IT professional that never has really been exposed to DevOps. How would you characterize what DevOps is? Just really simple to the kind of a seasoned layperson.
Ultimately, it's taking that handoff between development and operations and automating it.
Okay.
So 20 years ago, I was on a project or a set of projects, and anytime we wanted to go into production, we needed to go to a meeting. We had to have a checklist that went step by step with who needed to do what, how they did it, and so forth.
Okay. I remember building those. I was a project manager 20 years ago.
So we had that, right?
Yeah.
And then we ended up building push button deployment. And ultimately my set of instructions were go to this application, which we called Smooth Production Updates, which the acronym for was SPEW.
Okay,
so
nice.
you would spew things into production. So we thought that was a fun name.
Yeah.
But in the end, like my instruction was open spew, press the spew button, and it would go in, right? So all of those steps that we had to make sure the right people did it in the right way and they knew the right passwords and all those things, now that was a push of a button.
Okay.
And taking it out needs to be a push of a button, right? We've matured to where database changes, environment changes, server changes, all of that stuff can be done in that way. And it's just taking what we did 20 years ago, or what a lot of organizations we still see doing today, and automating that and speeding it up so we can spend all of our time on the business capabilities we're trying to add in the software.
Is it just the automation of manual steps, or is there more to it? And maybe what I'm really asking is, what have been the technologies that have evolved over the last 20 years that have really made DevOps possible? Because I'm assuming it just wasn't possible 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, so when we wrote, this spew application, we were actually writing code. Now there's tools out there that you're configuring. Like every platform, all of the cloud providers, they all have DevOps tools. You're going to be getting, all kinds of tools. But in the end, and now, like with the cloud, even our infrastructure, we can, when we did projects, we would get a server sent to us, get some memory. Oh, you need more memory, you go get more memory. You didn't just go change in a file, say I need to add memory to the server.
Well, that's kind of what I was hunting at. Is it virtualization? Is it hardware as a service? Is that a key part of DevOps?
Yeah, so infrastructure as code. So I'd say you can start all the way at the basics of just the build, right? So like we will do an assessment and say, is the build automated? Or because there's places where you build it, if you don't have access to this person's machine, you can't build the software, right? So we need to build it to be automated. Then we need to trigger that automatically. If someone makes a change, we want to automatically rebuild it. Then we want to automatically rerun the test. But then I need to get it deployed onto a server. Now, I can actually take the configuration of that server and automate that so that if I need to build a new server, it's going to just happen through code instead of that. So I can get more and more sophisticated in what's in there. But in the end, it's taking something. So one of the things is, as we're doing Agile, we're doing, we're going to reduce the batch size, which means we're going to release things more often. If you release things more often at the same cost per release, you're actually spending more money.
Yeah, we've been telling that story for 12 years. Yeah.
So how do I release something more often at a lower cost? So now I've got to automate out some of these costs, right? So, and it's just mind-numbing work. Like if you're just doing the same set of manual steps, or you're running the same tests every time, that's not a huge value add. What we want is to take that time that's recovered and now say, can I do exploratory testing? Can I do things to make sure that I'm testing the edge cases, or I'm really thinking from the customer's perspective, versus the things that just become rote, and that humans aren't very good at doing the exact same thing the exact same way again and again and again. So that's what computers do.
What's the relationship between, like, we talk about CI/CD pipelines and DevOps? So is that the same thing, or is that something different?
Yeah, a CI/CD pipeline is, DevOps is just kind of an all-encompassing term that includes, like, depending on people's definition of it, a CI/CD pipeline, build automation. Some people would include configuration management, or like version control for code, and then your infrastructure as code. So all of that kind of has that DevOps label around it. Okay. But in the end, each of them are really about, how do I get my teams able to get software out the door faster? Yeah.
So tell me, I'm sending you a softball here, I think. But in Agile, we talk about the ability of, like, maybe it's test first, or at least like really solid unit test coverage, making sure that the build never breaks. How important is having, like, really solid test coverage and knowing the health of the code all the time to being able to do what you're talking about in the DevOps world?
So first of all, in the DevOps will add value even if you're then manually testing it after you build it.
Oh, okay, interesting.
But so because now at least I can get it to the QA environment faster, people can test it and so forth. But if ultimately the software development slows down as soon as you're afraid to change the software.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
if I don't if I am new to a piece of software and code, and I go in and change it, and instantly 5 tests tell me that I broke it, then I can go look at those, figure out what I broke, do it again, and so forth. If I don't have any of that protection, it's actually like driving a car without brakes. If you had to drive a car 2 miles without brakes, you're going to go a whole lot slower.
Sure.
Because you have to anticipate anything that could possibly go wrong. But if you have the protection of something that says, okay, look, if there's a problem, I have a way of solving it, and I can just backtrack, fix it. In the end, like test automation and unit tests, they do 2 things. First of all, they make the DevOps investment much more valuable, because now it's not just saying, it's not just moving software from one place to another, but it's making sure that each step of the way, the software does more than it used to. We didn't move backwards.
Yeah.
And if we can make sure we're always moving forward, that's an awesome thing.
Yeah, so you and I, we've worked, this is the second time we've worked together, right?
Yeah.
So we worked together at Pillar 12, 13 years ago. Now we're working together here at LeadingAgile. You and I approached this from a very different perspective initially. LeadingAgile started off as really like business architecture focused, team formation strategies, governance, metrics, right? Getting practices in place and really working to get the overall delivery system optimized. But we hit a wall at some point, right? Because even though we could organize teams around the right things, we ended up with dependencies between teams that were very expensive to manage. So as you've been working with us, we're trying to bring in what we call our studios practice and the ability to do some product extraction type work. Talk to me a little bit about what that product extraction work looks like, why it's important, and then maybe for bonus points, like how does it tie into DevOps and some of the things we've been talking about?
So in the end, we want teams to be able to work independently, right? So
Absolutely.
We've done a lot of things organizationally to get them, to have a cross-functional team as much as possible, to be able to bring work to that team and have a good flow of how that team, the work flows of that team, and that team is ideally centered, connected to a consumer or a customer, so that they know how things are done. Often, when you've done that work, your code is not, if you started just writing code, once you form those teams, your code would probably look a lot like your teams.
Right, Conway's Law, I think,
Yeah,
isn't
right.
it? Yeah.
So, but we haven't written the code like those teams. So now that we've figured out that these are the product teams and here's what the work is, the code may be like these 2 teams have to, like everything they want to do, they have to do together.
Right.
So we really haven't, we've got these dependencies, right? And just like in organizations, dependencies are what slow you down.
For sure.
And require a lot of orchestration. Same thing in software. So if I can break those dependencies, so I can now have it, so this team may have a dependency on that other team, because as a bigger organization, that's always going to be the case. But if the code dependency is an API, then we know we have an agreed contract of how we're going to talk to each other. We can put tests around that. Now my team can work independent of yours, and there's a lot less friction.
Yeah, so one of the ways I've characterized it, and tell me if I'm wrong, right, because I'm not a hardcore engineer like you and your team are, but the way I tend to look at it is like the difference between a dependency and an interdependency. Like a dependency would be like, this has to move with this, and they have to move at exactly the same time, right? Because they're really tightly coupled.
Yeah.
And I think of an interdependency as like, this thing's independent, but the function of the 2 things goes together to create something that's actually more usable for the client. Is that a good way of thinking about it?
Yeah, and that's very much how we want to write software. And in the end, if I'm going to, so back to the DevOps piece, if I want to have my team be able to move things, initially the DevOps, if you think about our Basecamp model, right? Basecamps 1 and 2, we're putting in compensating controls.
Yeah.
We're doing a lot of orchestration.
So let's talk.
Which means
Finish your thought, and then I want to
Okay.
highlight what the base camps are for everybody.
Which means at the software level, we end up with those same So DevOps at Basecamp 2 is hard because in order to move one thing, I got to move all of these teams.
Yeah.
At Basecamp 3, when I have an encapsulated team, and if my software has been extracted and I have an encapsulated piece of software, DevOps actually becomes easier because it doesn't have to move the entire world in order to get one new thing in.
Yeah. So just for everybody's sake, one of the things about Leading Agile that I think is actually an incredibly powerful invention is this idea of putting a transformation on a journey with like intermediate steps you can actually measure. And so we came up with these 5 base camps. It's just really a reference architecture. It can be customized in a lot of ways, but a lot of times in a transformation, what we'll do is we recognize those dependencies are there. So we form teams and we coordinate dependencies and we orchestrate requirements and tie them up into traditional PMO governance models. Right, so we stabilize the system using Agile, but we know that those dependencies are there and they're slowing us down and they're driving orchestration costs. Then we start to reduce batch size, right? We can often do that without breaking all the dependencies. But that's the reason why you and I decided to partner on this, is because at some point in time, there's only so much you can do with organizational design. There's only so much that you can do with reducing batch size and improving release plans and all that kind of thing. It's like, unless we can go to Basecamp 3 in our world, right, and start to break the dependencies and have teams operate autonomously, you're only going to be as agile as the dependencies that you allow in the system. And I think that's what you're saying. It's because it's like, I've been on record for years talking about dependencies get in the way of Agile. And it's like, and with dependencies, you either have to manage them or you have to break them. A lot of times in Agile, I think SAFe is an example of this. Sometimes poorly done Agile at scale is an example of this, where if you have unmanaged dependencies, like, it's just going to be total chaos. Talk to me a little bit about that. I don't know if I set you up well for that question, but like, share with me your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, if I'm an engineer and I'm building a piece of software, and I say, look, every 2 weeks we're going to get something done. If I have to talk,
like potentially shippable, you mean like
shippable stuff, right? Yeah. So if I have to go coordinate with 5 other teams, maybe across the globe, in order to get that thing done, then it's just going to slow me down. And we can put in compensating controls and we can orchestrate around it. But if I actually get the software architected such that I can call an API, I know how that works, and I can do my piece, and that other group, if there's a piece that they need to do, they can do their piece, and it just comes together. We all can move a lot faster.
You mentioned, you used a word that we use internally a lot. I'd love for you to share with everybody kind of how you think about it. Compensating control. What does that mean? How did that come to be in our language?
Yeah. So, what would be great, like if we had 5 teams and each of them could just release independently.
That's like the holy grail.
That'd be great,
of,
right?
Agile workers,
and you're never going to get to where every team can just like do everything on their own time frame. So there's always going to. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't split into teams. You shouldn't break things down. It doesn't mean that you should have 100% top-down planning and not give anything to the team. But you may need, to orchestrate. Let's say with the security group or with the server group, right? So there's some compensating control we're going to put in place to say, well, since we don't have that complete freedom, we need to have this meeting, or we need to have this checklist, or we need to have this organization in place to make sure that the system can operate as smoothly as possible. But as we progress and we get more and more of this craft in place, we actually can then start to remove those and say, look, now, our security checks are automated. So back to the DevOps piece, every time we do a release, we run a core set of security checks, a core set of penetration tests to see, did we break anything? Is our software as secure as it used to be? Well, now I no longer need that compensating control of I have to work with the security group. It's built into the system. And the security group can spend all their time not retesting again and again, did we introduce this type of a vulnerability, but what are the new things? What do I need to do, right? So they can actually become proactive instead of just reacting to all the software that's trying to go out the door.
So bonus question, you know who brought in the word compensating control into Leading Agile?
I do not.
Yeah, Chris Beal.
yeah.
So Chris Beal worked with Matt and I back in our Pillar days, right? So we all worked together about 12, 13 years ago, and then I branched off and formed LeadingAgile. Chris went on his way. Chris came back and worked with us, and Chris comes from like a really heavy XP background. And so the fact that I converted Chris, and I'll take credit for converting him a little bit, to this way of thinking about transformation, I consider a win, right? And what's cool about it, and what Chris, when he introduced that phrase, was talking about is that we would love in every organization have totally independent cross-functional teams that can deploy independently, have their own culture, inspect and adapt, right? Solve customer problems. But when all those teams are linked together with organizational dependencies, staffing dependencies, technical dependencies, requirements dependencies, then they can't operate independently. And so pretending that they can is kind of a problem. So Chris coined the phrase compensating control because in the presence of dependencies, you have to do extra things to manage them. Right. But if you leave compensating controls in place, then that reduces your agility over time. So SAFe, the way I think of SAFe, it's like one big gigantic compensating control, right? And we don't want those compensating controls, but to some degree, they're kind of necessary. So as we articulated the Space Camp journey and started to think about what transformation looked like, in the early stages, you form teams, build backlogs, working test software, structure, governance, and metrics, and you have all these compensating controls to deal with the dependencies. The transformation journey is actually about reducing the dependencies, allowing the teams and the organizations to operate independently, and then ideally you deprecate some of the compensating controls so we get closer to the ideal of Agile. Yeah. Like, I think it's a powerful concept. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I think, we work with large organizations, and a lot of times, especially, I came from the XP world too.
I guess I take some credit for flipping you too. So.
Yeah. So, but early on, right, you're talking to an executive about the principles of Agile, and it just sounds like chaos, right? And they don't understand how they can achieve their business objective with this, right? Mm-hmm. And so we add some of these controls and structure, right? And what we've done is not just saying, okay, here's a system of delivery that's going to work with a whole bunch of compensating controls, and then you never get to the ideal of Agile.
Right.
Is, all right, here's a system of delivery that we're going to start with, but as we mature and as we get more and more capability in our teams, we can now pull off some of these compensating controls, and you're going to get closer and closer to that ideal.
Yeah, for sure.
So now, for an organization, a lot of organizations that are implementing SAFe or doing just kind of a one-time Agile, transformation or implementation,
just teaching practices,
right?
Kind of
They're
thing,
just teaching a practice first kind of approach. What they do is they end up, standardizing on those compensating controls, right? And ultimately, like if you standardize what you want to fossilize, right? So if you never wanted to change and never wanted to get more Agile, then you standardize on those compensating controls. But ultimately, what you need to do is standardize on these are the things we need to worry about, like teams, backlogs, working tested software. And as we get better and better at doing that, we can pull back those controls and we'll actually move faster.
Yeah.
And that's true on the organizational side, but that's true on the software side too, right? Early on, you may have a team that has all kinds of different levels of skill. They don't all agree on the definition of done. Your CI/CD isn't checking for coding standards. So you might have a compensating control of code reviews. Like, I need to review all this stuff.
Right.
As you mature, like, people may do a pull request. You may say anyone else on the team can go review that because now you've got that clarity on the team and you can move a lot faster. So in the end, like, don't standardize on the things that are temporary measures and make sure that you're constantly trying to move faster and faster.
Very cool. Is there any risk, getting back to the DevOps CI/CD thing, is there any risk or hurdles to going down that path without having the dependencies broken? Do you need to do the product extraction first? Or tell me a little bit about the relationship between those two concepts.
Yeah. I think you should do it as early as possible.
Okay.
So there's different portions of DevOps or different areas. So I'm going to talk back about our base camps again. If you're trying to get predictable, right? Like, usually, you can automate your build. You can have version control, so you know I'm building the exact same software in the exact same way, and you can become predictable with checklists and things. But ultimately, automation is a way to pull out that cost and redeploy those people to other things, right? So ultimately, now that build might be pretty big because now you have all these dependencies. So you might be building 10 teams code at once. So your DevOps, you may end up with a DevOps organization that's outside of your teams, right? And then over time, as you get to I have teams that are autonomous, working, fairly cross-functional. The code has been extracted. There's like relatively few dependencies. Most of the DevOps work there's still going to be a DevOps practice and some standards.
So that org almost becomes a compensating control in and of itself.
And so the DevOps is going to move into the team room.
Okay.
With the exception of we need to have a second set of there's maybe regulations or rules of why we need sign-offs and so forth. But that's we don't need an entire organization to go build the software for someone else. They can just build their own software once we get to that point. But I would advise to start early with these practices.
Very cool. So interesting conversation, Matt. Anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up today?
I don't think so. I would go back to the point I started with, which is just make sure you know why. What am I trying to achieve? Am I trying to become more predictable? Am I trying to reduce the batch size? Am I trying to be able to build, test, and deploy independently?
Yeah.
If I know what I'm trying to do and then scope my DevOps effort to that, then I'm going to avoid a whole lot of waste, and I'm not just implementing a tool for the reasons the tool vendor says it's good, and I'm going to be implementing it to solve a real business problem.
Very cool. Imagine if anybody is interested and want to talk with you about this or learning more information, they could reach out?
Yep.
Cool. Awesome.
Sure.
Okay. Great, man. Thanks for coming in town and having a conversation with me. I appreciate it.
No problem.